Um, and I will briefly introduce him, and then my co-host, Professor Eileen Chow, will say a little bit about the work that he will be speaking about, which he translated, and then we will hand over the microphone to Professor Berry. So Professor Berry, Michael, and I have known each other for a long time. I think nearly a quarter of a century, if my math is correct. We were graduate students together at Columbia University, and then have sort of gone our respective ways. Professor Berry is a remarkably prolific scholar, having authored, edited, and translated numerous works. His first work, which is quite relevant to the topic today, is History of Pain, Trauma in Modern Chinese Literature and Film. He's also translated and edited a series of interviews that he did in Chinese with 25 prominent directors from China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and the global diaspora. It's called Speaking Images, Interviews with Contemporary Chinese Filmmakers. Another work that he has that's coming out in both English and Chinese in the immediate future is a series of interviews with Jia Zhangke, another prominent Chinese director. He's also very established as a translator. The first book that he translated was Yu Hua's 活着, To Live, which is Yu Hua's, I think, best-selling work, and the English translation has been repeatedly listed as one of the best 10 or best 20 Chinese novels available in English. So this has been tremendously influential. He's translated Wang Yanyi's Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which has received several prizes, and several others. I could go on and on. Apparently at the beginning of this year, he was in the process of translating a novel by a Wuhan-based novelist, Fang Fang, at which point Wuhan went into shutdown, and someone pointed out to him that Fang Fang was keeping a public and very sort of high-profile diary, internet-based diary. He looked into the diary, thought this was very noteworthy, and immediately proposed to her that he table the novel of hers that he was translating and immediately start translating the diary into English. At that point, Wuhan had been in shutdown for a month. It was still in shutdown. She was writing every day. Michael immediately, even though he was teaching full time, started translating. I think he says in the afterword, 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and managed to complete the entire thing in sort of record time, finishing the translation just shortly after she finished the actual diary, which took her 2 months to finish. And that is the text that he'll be talking about today. So I will hand over the introduction to my colleague, Professor Chow, who will say a little bit more about the diary and its significance.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Michael, so much for joining us. Thank you for Professor Berry. As you know, as Carlos mentions, we've known Michael for a long time, him longer than me, but so this is also a very personal delight, even though here is abstract concept. But thank you for being here at Duke, and we're delighted to have you. I want to remind everyone that this is actually being recorded, and if this is an issue, please, let us know. But just I want to let everyone be aware of that, and also that we want to thank APSI for hosting this event, and also Professor Prasenjit Dwara for suggesting inviting Michael to talk about his just really this amazing work, this amazing contribution that he has literally worked day and night on in the last several months to see it come to fruition. Carlos had already talked about some of the context of Wuhan Diary, so I won't belabor the point. And I just want to say that Teju Cole recently had an article talking about what is the relationship of writing or chronicling the pandemic. And, he has this quote. He says, if journalism is the first rough draft of history, perhaps a journal is the first rough draft of literature. And Fang Fang, being a novelist, had this particular instinct to be a kind of almost seismographic machine, a kind of recording machine to feel the tremors of a particular moment in time with extraordinary sensitivity. And I think, Michael also, as a scholar, as a writer, as an artist, as a translator, similarly, had the sensitivity to recognize history in the making, and as he mentions in his afterwards, starts translating basically a month after she starts publishing. So there's this really interesting thing where this is a rare work of kind of simultaneity, because usually translations happen far later than the original work. But also, as Michael points out, and I'm sure he'll talk about this a lot more, is I'm fascinated by the idea that when we were all experiencing news of COVID, especially as it was first coming out of Wuhan, and then in the way in which East Asia more broadly was becoming much more sensitized to the news because of both SARS and MERS, the ways in which people were reacting. But in contrast to Western Europe or United States or Canada or places where there wasn't a sense of awareness of what could come, right? And that time lag then became the reality of our experience of COVID, which is, in many strange ways mirrors Michael's translation of Fang Fang, that month lag in your beginning point is really also the month lag of our collective consciousness in the West of what was to happen. So I think that she was in some ways a speaker from the future, right? A voice from the future speaking to us about what is to come. But I also think that, Wuhan is a very particular place, but now Wuhan has become a kind of pejorative, especially in the by this administration. And there's my father actually spent his childhood in Wuhan, in Hankou. And so there's this really particular sadness, which I've discussed with other people from Wuhan, that it's become only known as this source of virus and become used as a term that's a kind of, almost like a racial insult. And the ways in which I think Michael, in translating Fang Fang, restoring maybe a different kind of depth or complexity to the term Wuhan, right, to this place, and to give it more. And Fang Fang, in the diary itself, Fang Fang kind of concludes, and I don't know, I'd love to hear if Michael suggested this to her, but that she concludes with kind of discussing the history of Wuhan as part of this work. And I was wondering if that was kind of for an audience in translation, rather than for those who were originally following her diary. But when one thinks of Wuhan, when one thinks of Hubei, it's hard not to think about Chuci, right? It's hard not to think about really the origins of thinking about lament and exile. And in Quyen's Songs of Chu, like I've always loved, his laments attributed to Quyen, but not necessarily by him, densely elusive poetic laments dating from the 3rd century BCE, and at the collapse of the Chu kingdom. And Chu Ci, to quote David Hawkes, are the poetry of Tristia and Idenaria, right? The laments of exile. And Quyen laments that one is born to an age foul and murky. Sighs come from me often, the heart swells within, sad that I in these times never will be matched. And I feel like Fang Fang, as the kind of, this one of the brightest voices from Wuhan in the contemporary moment, still echoes that 3rd century BC moment of what is the writer's place to this land, what is the writer's place to this time, and what is the writer's responsibility in conveying that. And Michael, in then disseminating and translating and giving this Wuhan Diary, a different format, a published version collected in a single volume, as well as in another language, then fulfills further that Chuzi moment of Tristia Idenaria, right? That it now wanders and travels into another space and time as a story for us all. So I hope everyone can join us in welcoming Professor Michael Berry. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Eileen. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I also, like you said, it's a kind of a reunion. I've known Carlos and Eileen for many, many years. We don't get to see each other in person like the old days, but it's nice to be virtually connected during this event. I also want to express my thanks to Professor Duara for initially reaching out to me to invite me for this talk, as well as all of the staff at Duke who help with the technical and promotional aspects of this event. And of course, all of you who are logging in from all over the world. I look forward to a lively discussion with everyone today. I'm going to try to keep my comments on the short side so we have more time for dialogue. But before I even jump to my PowerPoint, Eileen in her comments and her opening remarks already kind of hit on a couple questions that I feel like maybe I should just begin with almost a dialogue and with an answer to some of her comments. And one of her questions she asked was, what is the responsibility of the writer? And I think that's a key question, not only for Fang Fang, but for the cultural politics of China today and what a lot of people are facing. And I think for a long time, I used to teach in my classes Mao Zedong's 1942 Yan'an Talks on Art and Literature, which was a kind of prescriptive text that told artists, writers, all creative figures in China during that time why we make art and what art is for. And in short, it's to serve the people. It's for particular classes, the workers, peasants, and soldiers, and it should have a political motivation. And art that is for art's sake, that is nihilistic, that is just aesthetically based, all of that should be pushed aside. It should be destroyed. And we should make art that can serve these kind of broader political, practical functions. For many years in my teaching, I've kind of taught that almost as a dead concept. At least early 2000s, there was a period of time where I could say, this is ancient history. We don't fully believe this anymore in China. People kind of have moved away from it. But starting the last, 5, 6, 7 years under Xi Jinping, 2013, 2014, in particular, I believe in 2014, there was a call, a nationwide meeting about artists and art workers, about fulfilling what this role of the artist is. And a lot of those ideas from 1942 not only became rearticulated and resurrected, but they became pushed with a newfound exuberance that I don't think we've seen in many, many years. And that whole question of what is the function of art, or in David Wong, who was a friend of, I know Carlos and Eileen and I, David Wong at Harvard University, he has a forthcoming book about the function of literature. What is the good, and he talks about in that book, what is the good story of China? And I'm gonna maybe even open with just a quote from that work, where this is David Wong writing, "The issue of truth claims leads to the ambiguous connotation of the Chinese character hao, good, positive, correct, or well, which is used to qualify Xi's storytelling. When he says, tell the good China story, this could also be translated as either tell the correct or right China story, or tell the China story well. Therefore, depending on how is interpreted, Xi's slogan takes on different charge, descriptive, interlocutory, imposing, or even imperative. The questions boil down to one: who gets the final say about the goodness of a story? And I think this question, which Eileen kind of brought to the table and David Wong talks about in this forthcoming book, and I think that's the question that so much of the controversy around Fang Fang's Wuhan Diary is also revolving around. Who gets to tell the Wuhan story? And there's a kind of ideological battle about who gets to do that. And maybe with that, I'm going to segue into my PowerPoint. All right, does everybody see that okay? Okay, so we already got some background about the book. So Fang Fang's Wuhan Diary she began writing in January 25th, 2020. I'm sorry, February 25th, 2020, and writes for 60 days. It is, oh, now I'm getting the dates mixed up. I'm sorry. It's got to be January 25th. Yeah, January 25th through March. And it goes for 60 days. It's a diary written in an online platform, primarily on Weibo and WeChat are the platforms where she was sending this out. Fang Fang, of course, is a veteran writer. She was born in 1955, spent her entire, from the age of 2, her entire life in the city of Wuhan. For all intents and purposes, she's a native of that city and is probably, of contemporary Chinese writers, the single writer most associated with the city of Wuhan. And so it seemed almost completely natural that when this outbreak happened, she would be the person to tell that story. And so when she started this blog, it was actually at the invitation of the editor of a literary journal who was hoping that maybe she could serialize it in that journal. However, it turned into an online format. And every night she would send out these posts that would go, again, first to Weibo, and then when her account was temporarily blocked, she migrated it over to WeChat. And over time, the posts really grew in their impact, in the readership, and they touched a certain chord with readers all around China and outside of China. Everyone in the Chinese-speaking world who was concerned about what was happening with the outbreak, who wanted to understand what was going on. They wanted, it was almost a place of solace, a place where they could find comfort. Fang Fang, for many of them, became almost a virtual friend to check in on her every day, see how she's doing, see how her friends and the citizens of her city are doing. And it really became a collective online space where eventually millions of readers, I remember early on, there was a period she was getting 2 to 3 million readers per post. Very quickly that escalated to over 10 million. Now some estimates are that there were as many as 50 million readers for many of these posts, and probably a lot more than that. And so the thing really, to use a bad analogy, it went viral. It was spreading all over the internet. And as the diary continues, it also transforms. And the diary contains different segments. There are usually portions about the weather, mundane recounting of details of everyday life. How is she going to get dog food when she runs out of dog food and everything is shut down? There's medical information. At this time, you have to remember, nobody knew what this coronavirus thing was. We didn't even have the word for COVID-19 yet. And so people were still trying to understand it, and Fang Fang was trying to understand it. So she's reaching out to doctor friends and getting information, medical information that she's sharing with readers. Some of it turns out to be accurate, some of it not so accurate, but this is kind of on the fly. It's not, and also the style of the work is very unlike Fang Fang's other works. It's not a polished, manicured, curated literary work. This is an explosive release that's coming out every night and capturing of the moment, in the moment, what she's feeling, what she's seeing, what she's experiencing. And then there's also these incredible passages where Fang Fang expresses a certain bravery and a certain ability to stand up and speak truth to power that you rarely see in contemporary China today. And for those who aren't familiar with the diary, I thought it would be helpful if maybe I read a short passage of that latter component. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of different facets to the diary, but these are some of the passages that I think have garnered some of the most attention. And so I'm just going to read a few, just about 2.5 pages. This is towards the end of the outbreak. Things are coming under control, and the local government requests a show of gratitude towards the government for all of the wonderful things that they've done for the citizens of Wuhan. And this is Fang Fang's response. Today, the word appearing most frequently in online chat groups is gratitude. The political leaders here in Wuhan have requested that the citizens provide a public expression of gratitude toward the Chinese Communist Party and the nation. Their thought process is really strange. The government is the people's government. It exists to serve the people. Government employees are servants of the people, not the other way around. These government leaders spend all their time studying political doctrines. How could they end up getting this so backward? Professor Feng Tianyu from Wuhan University said, As for this question of gratitude, let's not mix up the relationship between the people and those who hold power. If you're going to take those in power as gracious benefactors who require that the people get on their knees and thank them for their benevolence, I think you had better go back and listen to what Marx said during a speech in 1875. Marx despised Ferdinand Lassalle's notion of state supremacy and argued that the state has need, on the contrary, of a very stern education by the people. I'm sure that all the political leaders in Hubei and Wuhan very much respect the views of Professor Fang. If this current group of new leaders are educated, I wonder if they will really hear what Professor Fang was trying to say. That's right, the outbreak is now basically under control, and we should indeed express our gratitude for that. But it should not be the government standing up to express their gratitude. The government should start off by expressing their gratitude to the families of those thousands of victims, their loved ones, and the wrongful victims of this terrible scourge. They weren't even able to say goodbye to their family members or have a proper funeral. All they could do was keep the pain inside and bottle everything up. Meanwhile, virtually no one uttered a word of complaint. The government should express their gratitude to the more than 5,000 people still lying in hospital beds as they struggle for their lives against the god of death. It is their stubborn will to live that has slowed down the number of deaths. The government should express their gratitude to all the healthcare professionals and 40,000 angels in white who came to Wuhan from all around China to save people's lives. They worked in the face of great peril, pulling people from the grip of death one soul at a time. The government should express their gratitude toward all the workers and laborers who hustled all over the city during the course of this outbreak. They are the ones who kept this city functioning amid the crisis. And the government should save their biggest thanks for the 9 million residents of Wuhan who locked themselves in their homes, even though it meant facing all kinds of difficulties. Without their cooperation, this virus would never have been brought under control. No compliments or beautiful words would be considered excessive in describing the contributions that all these people made. My dear government, please suck up your pride and humbly extend your gratitude to your masters, the millions of citizens of Wuhan. Next, the government should make haste and beg for the people's forgiveness. This is the time for reflection and assuming responsibility. A rational government with a conscience that listens to the needs of its people and understands how to console them should, at this very moment, quickly establish an investigative team to piece together the full details surrounding the outbreak. Who was responsible for delaying the response? Who decided to withhold information about the outbreak from the public? Who were the leaders that, in order to save face, decided to twist the truth when reporting to their superiors and hide the truth from the public? Who was it that put political correctness above the lives of our people? How many people contributed to this disaster? Whoever had a hand in this should take responsibility. The people need someone to assume accountability. At the same time, the government should urge officials from various departments whose actions misguided the public, leading to massive numbers of deaths, to resign. Individuals to be investigated should include high-level government administrators, top officials from the Ministry of Propaganda, those in the media who helped cover things up, and top officials from the Department of Health. If any of them are criminally liable, let the courts decide their punishment. However, based on my observations, most Chinese government officials are lacking when it comes to self-reflection, not to mention those willing to take the blame and resign. In a situation like this, citizens should, at the very least, draft a public call for all those officials who took policies as the center of their world while treating people like trash to resign. How can we let these people with blood on their hands continue strutting around in front of the people of Wuhan, gesticulating as if they are heroes? Suppose that 10 or 20 officials stand up and resign as a result of this. At least we will know that there are a few officials left who still have a conscience. Tonight around dusk, a famous writer sent me a text. He wrote something that I found to be quite profound. Who could have ever imagined that a second catastrophe would befall the Chinese language itself? Gratitude. It's such a beautiful word, but I'm afraid it has been forever sullied. I wonder if moving forward, it will now also become a sensitive term that we aren't allowed to use. So that's a pretty remarkable piece of writing from Fang Fang. And those are the, I think, passages, those types of passages that really started to elicit a lot of the controversy and discourse around what this, not just the book, but the incident surrounding the book eventually became. But before I get into all that, I also want to say a lot of those words I just read, for me, sitting here in Los Angeles in, what are we, September 2020, they're just as relevant to what's happening in the United States in terms of accountability, in terms of failures. And so a lot of people who have wanted to take Wuhan Diary and twist it into some kind of tool that was being used to hurt China on the part of the West, or some kind of proof of China's errors. For me, what's most instructive about a text like that is how we can apply that to ourselves. Because sure, there were missteps in China during those crucial first 20 days, but in the United States, there have been missteps every step of the way since the outbreak came to these shores. And in China, they did remove several people from power in Wuhan, local government officials who had screwed up. I don't know of any officials in the United States who have really been held to accountability to that standard. And so I feel there's a lot we can learn, not just about China's response, but maybe where our own response needs to go moving forward. But let's continue on and talk a little bit about how this diary did spark this nationwide political debate. And there's a couple factors that were there in place that allowed this to kind of take place. And so the first is something I mentioned earlier, which was the diary had an unprecedented readership. Even for Fang Fang, who's been writing since the late 70s, she was shocked by the number of readers, the number of eyes that were coming to her diary every day. At one point, she even considered giving up because she was very self-conscious just about engaging with so many readers in such a manner. And I'm so happy that she persevered. But having a massive readership in China is one of the factors that also helped set up this debate, because there was so much at stake. One of the reasons Falun Gong, of course, was so threatening was because it had such a massive following. Any non-governmental organization or entity or individual that has that many readers and supporters can be seen as a certain type of threat. And then there are passages like I just read, the calls for accountability, which of course, if for those in power, those were also potentially threatening for some individuals. But another factor that I think is really crucial for setting the right environment through which this book could come under attack was the fact that Fang Fang, although throughout her career she's had a very good relationship with the government. In fact, she was chair of the Hubei Writers Association for many years. She has been a member of the Hubei Writers Association for most of her professional career. Many events with the Ministry of Culture and other high-level government organs. However, in 2016, she published a novel called Soft Burial. And that novel, a few months after its initial release, started to elicit incredible attacks by a group that she characterized as ultra-leftists. And of course, left and right are the opposite of what we think of in American political lexicon. So when we say ultra-leftists, we're referring to groups that are extremely pro-communist, pro-nationalist, to the degree that many of their actions and beliefs harken back to the Cultural Revolution, to those types of very hardline political tactics. And groups of these ultra-leftists began attacking Soft Burial in 2017. Their attacks were so venomous and so loud that eventually they did gain the ear of certain people wielding power, and the novel was actually banned. So you can't even find that book anymore in China. It was swiped from Douban and other websites. But why that's so important for Wuhan Diary is that you have the pre-existence of a community of detractors that are already after Fang Fang. And they're active. And so that's easy to reactivate for this current controversy with Wuhan Diary. In fact, it's not at all unlike or dissimilar from the current controversy regarding Mulan, right? We all know that last summer, there was a controversy regarding the actress and remarks about the Hong Kong protest movement, and that launched a ban Mulan movement. And once you have that up and running, when new information comes out, like the Xinjiang camps, it's easy for that to become something much larger, because you already have the machinery, propaganda or a publicity machinery up and running. And so this is very similar in that sense. And so what you have is this initially a fairly small group of ultra-leftists, but several of them have a very loud voice on Weibo. They have millions of followers, and they start lauding attacks. And there's a direct relationship between Fang Fang's calls for accountability and the frequency with which she writes passages like the one I just read, and the tenacity of those attacks. And so you can really see how those are linked. And eventually, as the diary continues, her own response, reaction, and exchanges with the attackers kind of take over. And I would say the last third of the diary, probably maybe half of the narrative, is about the online attacks. And it becomes a book about not just the coronavirus, but also another kind of virus, the virus of social media and cyberbullying, and this other type of virus takes over. And so this unprecedented level of cyber attacks coming from so many different levels, this is the kind of preconditions that allowed the novel to kind of turn into this cultural explosion. And now we can ask, what were the attacks focused on, and what were they bringing to the table? What were they criticizing her for? And there's quite a few things here that they're coming after her about. And in fact, I recently heard an interview with a biographer who just wrote, I believe his name is Lai. He wrote a book about Joseph McCarthy called Demagogue. And in Demagogue, he talks about one of the strategies of Joe McCarthy was waging one bombshell after another in the media, to the point that before anyone can even offer a formal response, there's already another attack. So you attack about X on Monday, and then Y on Tuesday, and Z on Wednesday. And even if you do respond or reply, it doesn't matter, because there's already 3 more attacks that have been waged since then. And when I heard that, it's exactly the same strategy that was employed against Fang Fang. There were so many that the attacks were waged like a machine gun, one after another. There was just an inexhaustible fuel of issues that they were coming at her. But these are just a few of them. And so one of them is the fact, are criticisms that the book is based on hearsay or secondhand accounts. So one thing we should be very clear about, Fang Fang is not a frontline worker. She is not at the hospital in Wuhan treating patients. She is not out there directing traffic. She's sitting in her apartment, and she's seeing the world through the lens of what we're doing right now, through her laptop, through her cell phone, on the telephone with her friends. And in that sense, it's very similar to what so many of us, even today, how we're experiencing the coronavirus. And I think that's also one of the reasons the book appeals to people, because we can all relate to that. That is, unless you're a frontline worker, that's how most of us are encountering this, including most people in Wuhan. And so it's only natural that that's the lens through which she's going to tell her story. However, her detractors claim it's all hearsay, it's all secondhand information. And in fact, in the book, she repeatedly says, my friend said this, my doctor friend said this, I spoke to my friend who's a professor, he said that. And I should make it very clear, and Fang Fang does this in the book, the reason she does not disclose names is because it's very simple. She knows she is the target of thousands of online attacks on a daily basis. And there's a kind of witch hunt, which I'll come to soon, whereby anyone that she mentions or is friends with, they become targeted as well. Even I became targeted. And so it's only natural she's going to withhold those names for the protection and the privacy of those individuals. Otherwise, they're going to be harassed. And so, but that becomes one of the major talking points. The other is authenticity. And as I mentioned earlier, she's writing, this is explosive. She's releasing these every day, each night. She's shooting out these posts. And some of the information, there are a couple of errors. There are times where she gets something wrong, and she always corrects it. She always goes back and says, 2 days ago, I wrote about X. Actually, this was the truth. This is what happened. It turned out to be a rumor. She also repeatedly will set up information by saying, I heard this. I'm not sure if it's true or not. And any reasonable reader who comes to the table will see that and realize this is someone kind of fumbling in the dark, trying to understand an unprecedented outbreak under unprecedented circumstances, and doing her best to report with authenticity and accuracy. But sure, there are a few things that she gets wrong, but those, the detractors, they grab onto, and they just like rabid dogs do not let go, and they repeat them. And there's a couple arguments, one about cell phones, which I can talk about later if people want to hear about that, that just become talking points for months and months. Third are conspiracy theories. And I was never one much for conspiracy theories, but honestly, I feel like my life has been a conspiracy theory for the last 5 or 6 months. And the conspiracy theories revolving around this book are unlike anything I've ever encountered, at least personally. And just a few of them include the book was not even written by Fang Fang. I was the actual writer. She was a ghost writer, and I'm actually a CIA agent. And I was writing this at the behest of the American government to produce a weapon that could be used to harm China. Another was that I wasn't the real translator. I was just a puppet, and there was a team of translators. That's how the book was produced so quickly. And people were working day and night in some kind of CIA office to produce this fabricated document. Another deals with the origins of the virus, something Fang Fang never talks about, but somehow this got pulled into. Political motivations concerning the book, all of these things, and there's so many more. And again, we can unpack this as we go. And then another mode by which the attacks took form were personal attacks. And these include everything from investigative videos posted online with professional editing. They look like they could have come out of CCTV or some very high-tech studio, but these glossy exposés about Fang Fang's finances, her history of international travel, and trying to pin her as this elitist who was entitled and is exploiting people. One of the taglines that came out was that Fang Fang was eating the mantou, the steam bun soaked in human blood, a reference to Lu Xun, of course, and that basically saying that this diary was her way of exploiting the sacrifice and the death of the Wuhan people to gain personal profit and fame. And so as these attacks came, she kept claiming that the people attacking her were these ultra-leftists, which the attackers really didn't like. And they kept trying to get rid of that label and saying we're not ultra-leftists. However, at the same time, this is what some of their attacks look like. And this is a Cultural Revolution era style propaganda poster, 打倒帝国主义走狗, 卖国贼, Fang Fang, right, down with the imperialist running dog and national traitor, Fang Fang. And these types of things start appearing all over the internet. And there's just a treasure trove of these kinds of images. And now I want to move on to how the attacks were waged and how this happened. And so it's a multi-pronged strategy that's employed. First, you have social media attacks, and these come from accounts with 3 followers that you never heard of that somebody opened yesterday, whether they're a bot or a troll, it's hard to know. But there's all kinds of these ghost accounts that are created. There's also some very influential Weibo users, ones with 8 million users that are attacking her. And some of them are posting, just a few sentences. Others are writing 5,000 word essays, just tearing her apart. But those are coupled with death threats. And the death threats sometimes are posted in public forums, and sometimes they come through private messages. And Fang Fang received them. People in her circle of friends received them. I received them. I believe possibly the German translator may have also received them. But this is a tactic by which also to silence your enemy, so to speak, because if you're getting death threats, it's a form of intimidation and hopefully to shut people up so that they're maybe going to cease their activities. They're going to be a good boy or a good girl and get in line and do what these trolls want them to do. But it also creates a very unfair playing field in terms of how you respond and how you engage when the other side is wielding these kind of threats at you. But it was much more complex than that. There was also a disinformation campaign, this employment of so-called fake news. And so there were dozens upon dozens of articles about the book, various facets. And again, I'm happy to talk about some of those types of attacks. But this disinformation campaign would put out stories that I can tell you, as someone who had followed the evolution and been a part of the evolution of this whole process, were 100% fabricated in most cases. Sometimes there's kernels of truth that are mixed in, but the main tagline of many of these is 100% fabrication. Just to give you one example of the type of disinformation campaign, a type of attacks, is at one point the publication date of the book was going to be May 19th. And on May 21st was when the Lianghui, the big Communist Party conference, was supposed to take place. And on social media and later in official reports that start becoming in the media, there were allegations that this was an intentional choice on the part of Harpervia, the publisher, the author, and the translator, that we were trying to kind of throw a grenade into the Lianghui to release this book just before a major political meeting in order to exact the maximum amount of damage, which of course, one, Lianghui didn't even announce the date of their meeting until after the publication date had been established. But two, I'm sure, no offense to my editors at HarperCollins, who were wonderful, I don't think they even probably heard about this Lianghui. That it just wasn't on anyone's radar. But this is the kind of thing that generated dozens of news stories and hundreds of Weibo attacks and accounts. So much so, we actually did change the publication date to try to avoid even the slightest semblance that we might be trying to do something like that. But this is the type of disinformation articles that were flying rampant on the internet. And then you have the silencing of stories and individuals defending Fang Fang. Probably most prominent is the case of Liang Yanping, a professor who was expelled from the Chinese Communist Party and banned for teaching for speaking up for Fang Fang. She was subject to an investigation and faced very grave consequences for speaking up. But many others, such as the poet Wang Xiaoni, and there's a handful of individuals that were also subject to investigations and various types of censure for being on Fang Fang's side. And that also, and another way that it's not just the investigations, but posts that were in support of Fang Fang were also removed from the internet. And so all that's left are the trolls, and Weibo becomes the land of the trolls, and normal readers only get one side of the story. And when you have that happening, it's very easy to turn public opinion from one direction to the other. And then, of course, there's pressure to suppress the publication of the book. I don't have to say much about this, but it's very clear that there is no Chinese edition of Wuhan Diary. And I'll just leave it at that. It does not exist in Chinese as a book right now. And then finally, this inundation of parallel official narratives, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So, and now just to give you a couple examples of some of these things, even before our edition was published on May 15th, you had the publication of these books, one by obviously a pseudonym Fanren, an everyday person, called Great Wuhan But Bad Diary. This was actually released internationally on Amazon Germany, Amazon US, and very interestingly, it recently disappeared. You can't find any trace of it anymore. It just was swiped away. But this is also a very kind of fascinating aspect of doing research on the Fang Fang phenomena, is the temporal kind of, the posts that exist yesterday, in 2 days they're often gone. And so you're always kind of trying to catch up. This ephemeral nature of the whole discourse, and the way that it's so easily erased and rewritten says a lot about how we think about history. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing a lot of thinking about this and writing about it, because I feel it's so important to preserve this history that is literally being erased before our eyes in terms of the digital footprint. But these are just two book-length publications that are all attacks on Fang Fang. And then you have these kind of big character posters. These are posted very close to Fang Fang's home in Wuhan. I translated one of them. I'll just read a section so you can get a sense of this. This is an open letter to Fang Fang. Fang Fang, one who consumes steam blood soaked in human blood. She was born into a new China, raised under the red flag, and has enjoyed all the various benefits and treatment of the state system. And now she has done terrible things which have deeply harmed our nation with false claims. No need for Fang Fang to ask who I am. I know who I am. I am a peasant from the countryside who yesterday was still in the fields planting peanuts. Though that may be the case, this has not stopped me from coming to Wuhan. I have made my way here to carry out a crusade against you, Fang Fang, to express my hatred and anger for what you have done. I hereby forcefully request that you, Fang Fang, turn every bit of your property and assets over to the state. You should shave your head and take up the vows of a Buddhist nun, or use your own death in order to repent for your sins and crimes against the people of this nation. If this is not done, I will take it upon myself as an individual to carry out justice in accordance with the Chinese people's ancient and pure methods of chivalrous justice. This attack against Fang Fang will be both verbal and physical. And so this is starting to turn into an almost unprecedented attack. I mean, I've studied these things and taught the Cultural Revolution my whole career, but I don't think we've seen a political movement like this that went nationwide, that lasted for months on end, and that pervaded so many different aspects, including pop culture. And so you start getting Anti-Fang Fang diss songs, and you can find these on YouTube. You can find them on Youku and various Chinese platforms. There were several that are professionally produced, polished pop songs with professional singing, and the lyrics are all tearing apart Fang Fang. And they all hit on the 6 or 7 major points of criticism, as if they're rehearsing a script. And in fact, there's also several of these Western pop icons, in this case Jay-Z and Alicia Keys, singing Empire State of Mind, which was redubbed with Anti-Fang Fang lyrics. So here you see in the subtitles, Jay-Z saying, talking about an old lady, her name is Fang Fang, and it's just surreal that this book could take on these kind of very strange life forms. Anti-Fang Fang political art, this is called Crown a Jester, and there you see Fang Fang as a clown holding up what's called Lie Diary, which is written on the spine of the book, and literally handing the knife over to this American military general, because one of the main attacks is that the diary is in fact a knife that Fang Fang is giving to the US as a tool to harm China. So here is the kind of humble servant getting her crown of spikes with a chain, looks more like a dog collar to me. And meanwhile, the Western media is eating this up, right? You have like dozens of representatives from the Western media. But this really capitalizes on all the main talking points of the attacks. They're all kind of there, crystallized in this image. And what's interesting is the artist in videos, this kind of made this and other images, such as images of George Floyd's death, images of Donald Trump in the White House, have made him something of a cyber celebrity. And he actually did an interview with Global Times where he said that he looks at his art as a form of resistance. And what's very interesting is here, what you see in the rap songs, what you see in this art, is this inversion of the notion of resistance. Rap, we all know in American hip hop culture, it has its roots as a voice of dissident and resistance. Think of Fight the Power, right? And here, what's happened is there's this very strange inversion whereby Fang Fang, who here is really, I'm not going to say she's the dissident, she's not at all the dissident, but the diary does include passages which call for accountability. They call for social change. They call for a progressive kind of agenda in terms of its engagement with society. And these images flip it around and they portray her as the entitled, rich, spoiled government official who's starting to harden China. And now they're using this art, such as political art, such as rap music, and claiming that they're being the resistors, they're being the absurders, they're challenging the power structure. Actually, it's the opposite. Fang Fang is the one here that is challenging the status quo, and they're appropriating art forms that are traditionally used as kind of more dissident art forms to, in fact, reinforce that status quo and reinforce the political norms. And so it's quite interesting how all of this has been playing out. And just to give you a sense of the witch hunt and how that played out with writers like Wang Xiaoni, with professors like Liang Yanping. And there was an actual WeChat group called 红色小兵, Little Red Soldiers. And this is a post they wrote. 下一个会是谁呢? 那就去继续看芳芳的朋友圈吧. So, who's going to be next? Keep watching Fang Fang's circle of friends to find out. This is the definition of a witch hunt, to guilt by association, tracking people down who are associated with the writer, who are friends with her, and they become targets. And this is one of the accounts of the trolls who are openly just putting out their motivation right there. If you come out, and this is also serves as a form of cyber terrorism, because if you come out and speak up for Fang Fang or any of her friends, you're going to be targeted too. And so this just shows you how deep this rabbit hole goes. But now the question is why? Why is there all of these attacks, and what's at stake? And so part of it goes back to Eileen's initial question about who gets to tell the story, who gets to control the narrative about the outbreak in Wuhan. And this is of crucial importance to many, many players. Part of it also goes back to this issue of accountability. That, of course, is very threatening to certain government officials, certain people in power who are afraid how deep down the rabbit hole this trail of accountability might go. That is also, I think, very threatening to certain individuals. And then you see I have the issue of international reparations. Fang Fang never talks about that in her book. Also, origin of the virus, Fang Fang never talks about. That's why I put asterisks. And U.S.-China political tensions. Those three items, Fang Fang, I want to make this crystal clear. She does not deal with these items in the book yet. The controversy surrounding the book, these have become crucial features. And the detractors of the book have repeatedly claimed that the book would be used, appropriated, weaponized in order to play into these different debates and these different controversies. And so you see a work of literature, a work of testimony, a diary that has no aspirations or intentions to serve any of those functions. And it gets pulled in repeatedly. And not only pulled in, but the allegations are that Fang Fang has masterminded these things, and she's intentionally trying to intervene in these types of debates. And then finally, and I think this is one of probably the key reasons why this book is so important, is because besides the coronavirus, besides US-China relations, it taps into larger debates about the very nature of civil society in China. What kind of country do people want? Do they want a country where someone can write a diary and post it on Weibo without it being censored and publish a book about it, where people can have civil debate online without being attacked by trolls? What kind of country do we want to live in? And that's the issue, I think, that really became a lightning rod issue, whereby I mean, I've seen accounts of families not talking to each other because one of them wants to stand by the government and tell the good story, and they feel that Fang Fang is on the wrong side of history, and those who very adamantly feel they're on Fang Fang's side. But I think it's this crucial debate about the nature of civil society which really says a lot about the discourse that surrounded the book. And eventually, where we go from that is this very interesting kind of bifurcation of the diary narrative. And so the reception splits. And you have in the West, these are just a couple of headlines from the New York Times, basically all lauding the book as this great group work of courage. Whereas in China, you see headlines like these, where they're all disparaging the book. If you look at the Amazon reviews of the book, this is as of last night, they're mostly 5-star and 1-star. And I think that's a very good metaphor for this reception and this split. And most of the 1-star users are Chinese trolls, which have hopped the pond, so to speak, to try to break the legs of this book, which is also a very interesting development, because I don't know of any other publications that have so enraged Chinese netizens that they've actually gone to Amazon in Germany and America and different sites and just hammer it with 1-star reviews as a means to try to challenge the authenticity of the author's voice. And then you also have the physical manifestation of the publication. So internationally, are going to be 20 different editions of Wuhan Diary. These are just a couple: Turkish, German, Italian, and Japanese. And you start getting Wuhan Diary kind of becoming an entire genre. But internationally, when we think of Wuhan Diary, we think of Fang Fang, we think of these accounts. Maybe we also think of Guo Jing's account here on the left. But in China, there's a very different Wuhan Diary that has risen up. And that is what you see here, Wuhan Diary of the Resistance Against the Outbreak. On the right is 2020 Wuhan Diary. Here is Diary of the Battle with the Disease, Angel's Diary, which is diaries of first frontline medical workers, the Wuhan Battle Against the Disease Diary, and all of them are using diary. And And I see that as an attempt to fill the absence of the space that's been vacated by the suppression of Fang Fang's diary. And in its place, we have this whole ecosphere of maybe more than a dozen alternative Wuhan diaries that have risen up. And so I'm probably going over time, so I should probably wrap it up and open it up for discussion here. But I'll just say there's so many lessons I think we can take away from Fang Fang, even from the simple things like compliance with health protocols that she's doing even in late January. In America, we're still struggling for the essential role of citizens to hold their government and political leaders accountable for missteps. And I'm not talking about China so much here. I'm talking about, I feel so strongly that we need our Fang Fang. We need someone that has the courage to speak out, to hold our leaders accountable. And the importance for everybody to tell their own story. And also it has given me faith in literature as having the power to witness, to shape the world, to impact change, because I know of no other book that I have seen coming out of China that has just good or bad, positive or there's so many different angles, but this is a book that matters, that people care about, and has in many ways become a lightning rod or a metaphor for so much of what we're all going through during this coronavirus era. So I'll stop here and look forward to your discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael. So a brief procedural note before Eileen and I start with the discussion part of the event. So for those of you that logged in late, we will now follow with a discussion. Eileen Chow and I will have a discussion with Michael Berry. And then in the third and final portion of the event, we will invite audience questions. And to smooth out that process, I ask that you, via the chat function of Zoom, send me a very brief summary of your question together with your real name and your institutional affiliation if I don't already know who you are. And then we'll try to accommodate as many questions as we can. So I'll start off with the conversation part. So Michael, this is really great. This is really fantastic, and kudos to you both for sort of being willing to take up this project on such short notice and devoting such a significant amount of time during what, as we all know, was a fairly very difficult spring for everyone, particularly people who are have children and are dealing with family and teaching and this and that. My question though is this: so in your talk, you emphasize Fang Fang's stress on calls for accountability. Basically, this injunction to those in power, and the role of these ultra-leftist netizens in attacking her for that. In my reading of the diary, and you kind of allude to this in your afterword, the diary can almost be divided into two halves, right? Where the first half, she's writing sort of in isolation, doesn't really know what's going on, is just trying to provide information, is dealing with the mundanities of ordinary life existence, like how to buy cat food, right? That she doesn't have enough cat food to feed her cat, and she has to feed her cat rice, and stuff like that. And then it's really in the latter half of the diary where the situation has begun to calm down. The daily sort of numbers of new cases has sort of decreased. People, the panic, the confusion has started to die down. That then she becomes more assertive in demanding answers, right? Demanding accountability. But what's interesting though is that even in the first weeks of the diary, it seems like there was a lot of censorship, right? And not only on the part, but official censorship. And she was alluding to this. She's like, well, my post from yesterday was taken down. Hopefully this one will stay up a little bit longer. Can you say a little bit more about what it was about her diary in those first initial weeks that was eliciting pushback, not only from these ultra-leftist readers, but from the censorship apparatus itself?
So, one thing is that on Weibo, people can report you if they feel a post is inappropriate. And so some of these ultra leftists would just report her posts and then they would be taken down. And so she was very careful not to blame the quote unquote Chinese government for censoring her, but she would blame the platforms, WeChat or Weibo, because of this mechanism of, if you've got an army of trolls, one of the things they can do is hammer you with these reporting, hit the report button, right? And a jubal or whatever it's called. And then that can result in a post being banned or taken down. So that could be part of it. But there are elements even early on in the diary. For instance, when she talks about the Chinese New Year banquet with 40,000 families that attended, she's very critical, even at that early stages, just how ridiculous this is. And so she does start rattling the cage a little bit, even quite early on. But what the real turn, the real shift happens actually with the announcement of the international publication of the book. That's where the trolls just go nuts and the whole thing gets taken to another level. It's somehow, everything she said, even the most vocal calls that you really never see in Chinese social media, you never see well-established writers making these kind of calls, but even those were somewhat, they were contained in a way. They felt that they were acceptable to some degree. But as soon as news leaked that this was going to go global and there would be international editions, the trolls exponentially multiplied, and actually that was used as a method to recruit more trolls, because now it became became something of national pride. And I would argue that that's where the discourse, I could even have something I wrote about this, but I don't know if I'll read it all. But I mean, I wrote a book many years ago, I think Carlos mentioned in the intro, A History of Pain, where I talked about two modes of trauma. One is centripetal and one is centrifugal trauma. So one of them is basically an internal incident, say an act of violence within the nation that triggers a kind of destabilization and causes, in some cases, diasporic imagination, people to question authority, but something that your own government, your own nation creates, and it goes outward. The other is an external attack or something from the outside in that then triggers a renewed imagination, a rejuvenation of the nation itself. And the reason I'm going into this is because Fang Fang's diary is both. It starts off as an internal trauma that becomes processed by a sense of destabilization, questioning power, questioning what's happening with the structural nature of society, of government. But when this happens, this being when news of the book goes global, that's where the shift takes place. And now it becomes an external trauma. This is the US trying to hurt us. Someone's taking that evidence and they're going to hurt China. And with that becomes an incredible galvanization of this patriotic thought. And instead of just a smaller group of trolls, you now have a much broad basis to draw upon, because now it's us against them. It's the US versus China. It's been pulled into the trade war. It's been pulled into all these other discourses. And so I see that as a kind of line of demarcation, and also really one of the really fascinating aspects of the book in the terms of how it transformed and made this basically a book that was beloved and had tens of millions of readers, and almost overnight, within the span of just a couple of days, becomes demonized, attacked, and thrown under the bus.
So that's great. Just a very brief follow-up. So it sounds like the announcement, or in your characterization, that the announcement of the English and German translations was a key catalyst in sort of exacerbating this online response. So even as you're translating the work in real time, it seems like you were influencing the trajectory of the work itself. So you became both a translator, but then in some ways a co-creator of the phenomenon that the work represented. Have you reflected on your role and maybe shaping the nature of the work and its position in China?
Well, I think I've certainly the fact that I was translating it and news of the and translating it so quickly, that was something that also generated a lot of attacks. Why is the only reason that the detractors could think of why it was so quick was because they needed that weapon quick. We need to have our tools to attack China. In fact, it's the polar opposite of that. This was me seeing this, sitting in Los Angeles and seeing what was playing out through Fang Fang's diary and realizing, my God, we got to wake up. This is spreading. It could, I didn't really anticipate it would spread so quickly all over the world. Nobody could have anticipated that, but I did see a pressing need to tell this story and get it out quickly. And I couldn't, and that's why I worked so quickly was, as you mentioned, I was doing 5,000 words a day, 7 days a week. Just, I've never done that for any book. And the reason I did that, and my arms, my tendons were killing me, but it was because it felt like a life and death thing. You felt like when Fang Fang wrote about that 40,000 person banquet and says how ridiculous it is, we have an infectious disease and they're having this mass gathering. And the same day in the US, I'm seeing a report that Trump insists on going through with his mass rallies. And I felt, my God, like people need to read this because, they're a month ahead of us. They've seen where this is going. I've seen where it's going now through Fang Fang's eyes. And I felt this incredibly pressing need to get it out as quickly as possible. And so I certainly played a role, but there were also, there were editors, there was an agent, there were many people involved in making this happen. But, and actually one of the aspects that was so controversial about not just the release, but there was a particular narrative that was uploaded to Amazon's website in both Germany and the US that elicited, and the narrative was, that was something the publisher wrote, the editors at the publishing house, and they also gave it a subtitle that was very controversial. And Fang Fang had not cleared either the narrative or the subtitle. I had seen the subtitle, but not the narrative. But all of that went live on Amazon before anybody had vetted it. And that narrative was very explosive to Chinese readers. But what was very interesting was, I've worked on a lot of books over the course of my career. I've never seen an Amazon book description translated into Chinese and circulated online within hours of it being uploaded. Before I had even knew it was online, there were attacks against that narrative and against the subtitle. And so there were definitely, it was a very unique situation in terms of the amount of attention that was being given to, and then after we changed, so because it was controversial, we changed that narrative. As soon as Fang Fang saw it, she insisted it be changed. I insisted it be changed. It was changed very quickly. However, for months after that, the original narrative and the original subtitle are still being circulated online and still being attacked, and because it was good fodder for the trolls. And so, but that was definitely one piece of this puzzle.
So thank you, Michael. Just so enlightening and so interesting. I love the passage that you read. In some ways, the question I was going to ask was what Carlos already asked in the follow-up. But, given that you were essentially translating in real time with a temporal lag, you were kind of a co-creator. And you mentioned that you, in fact, had, very frequent conversations with Fang Fang, right? And the editors every day. So it wasn't just that you were translating, but in some ways you were shaping her narrative too. I don't mean in the kind of CIA conspiracy theory sense, but I meant that in having an interlocutor, right? That, and then also for her to imagine her work being dispersed, that changed, I assume, so that's in that sense, that kind of collaboration, right? Not necessarily you guiding her or feeding her any insights, but that suddenly she, in her mind, was imagining it not as something like dispatches from Wuhan, but really dispatches to the world, right? So that was one sort of observation and question I had. But maybe I'll ask a more nitty-gritty one, which is, Orson Welles' whole thing, like a story, if you want a story to have a happy ending, it depends on where you end the story. And a diary is by definition bounded by a human life, perhaps. And so the story can go on, just like we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months or a year or 5 years in terms of COVID. And I'm curious about the decision to translate as a book, right? So when does this demarcation, since you were translating already in February, was there any sense of also translating and publishing in real time? So since having a digital space for this, so that you would kind of mimic the ongoingness of this work, and also that once it was this, a decision was made to make this into a volume, and then you were translating it, then in some ways it became bounded, the way that Wuhan Diary maybe would not have been bounded. So I'm just kind of curious about really thinking about the genre, the form of the diary, and the way in which you as a translator participated in those decisions.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, so I did correspond extensively with Fang Fang throughout this process. There were days where we were texting each other for hours on end, literally, but I never gave her advice or creative input in terms of content, or said, oh, have you thought about writing about this? Or it'd be cool if you wrote about this. There was never any conversation like that. And so I didn't want to interfere in any way with her creative process or give her notes from the publisher. There was none of that whatsoever. Of course, what quantum physics tells us, you can't observe something without, impacting it or whatever. And so I'm sure that deep in her psyche, she knew that very early on that we were going to translate this. I was already translating it. And so she knew that eventually it would have a wider audience and a wider market. But I didn't see a shift in her, the tone or the content of her diary vis-a-vis that change in terms of the actual writing. I did see a change with the trolls and the way that played out, but I didn't see the fact that she knew there was going to be all of these different international editions. I didn't see any concrete manifestation of that in the actual writing. As for the format, just as I was starting to translate, there would actually been a bunch of rogue editions that were already out there. So there were people without Fang Fang's authorization, that some had put up websites to translate it, some had published excerpts in various online platforms. And so after HarperCollins bought the rights, all of those got asked to be shut down. And we never talked about doing it as a blog or an online platform. That would have been the publishers to their discretion. They never talked about that. They did talk about doing a kind of doing two versions. So that is basically publishing the first 40 days, no matter where she's at. We want to get this out quickly because it's timely, because the world wants to understand what's happening. And so there was a talk, at one point the subtitle was 40 days under lockdown, Wuhan Diary 40 days under lockdown, because we were just going to do 40 days. And then when the actual thing was complete, then we would do a full version that would come out later. That was one of our early tentative plans. And at some point when we realized, one, that she was going to end it, I think initially it was 54 days she was going to end it, then she extended it to 60 days. But once we had a clear endpoint, we decided, or the publisher decided, to just wait for that. Part of it was we knew it was going to end after 60 days, her diary, but also I was able to almost catch up. And so there was a point towards the end, I was just a few days behind her. And so I would be able to deliver the translation very shortly after she completed the initial diary, which would allow them to publish and meet their internal deadlines that they were setting up for the production of the book. And so there were tweaks, and there were other editions that thought about also doing just a shorter version, like 40 days. But eventually we did the full unabridged version. We did have talks at one point about doing a second abridged version, but eventually we decided just to have the one full version out there.
Great, thank you. So we probably should open the floor to questions. I have plenty more, but I really want to hear a conversation with our audience as well.
Before we open, though, I want to answer one of your earlier questions, Eileen. You asked about, actually, I don't even know if it was a question, but during your introduction, you mentioned the word or the title, Dispatches from the Future. You said that was actually, so one of the points of attack was the subtitle, and which was initially dispatches from the original epicenter and was later changed to dispatches from a quarantine city. But the origin of that subtitle was the editor at HarperCollins emailing me when I sent him not the final version, but just pages, because we were on such a tight schedule. As I'm translating, he's copy editing. I'll send him a couple thousand words, then I'd move on. And he one day he sent me an email and said, my God, if I was going to publish this today, I would call it Dispatches from the Future. Because there was this uncanny sense that everything she had talked about and or witness to were things that we were experiencing now or about to experience. You could really feel that temporal lag. And that's where dispatches came from. And later, the trolls politicized it and said the word dispatches, the dictionary definition, is a foreign official or journalist or military attaché. Therefore, Fang Fang is an agent of the United States. And that's why they call it dispatches, because she's working for the CIA. But this is where it comes from exactly what your intuition also told you, dispatches from the future.
Great. Well, thank you both. Thank you all. So we will move directly now into the Q&A portion. The first question I received is from Rui Zhong from the Wilson Center. Rui, are you still online?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Hi, I really appreciate the talk. My question is, in the aftermath, after the official narrative was set down, there was this public pressure for basically all public figures and creatives to really stick to that narrative or sort of face certain consequences. We had WeChat groups shut down. We had, a really large wave of censorship hit China around the beginning of the March. In your observation, how do you think that this has impacted Fang Fang's colleagues and fellow writers and other types of creatives documenting the pandemic? Thank you.
That's a tricky question. I think there are people out there who are continuing to bear witness, but I suspect that a lot of people may have gone underground after they saw the attacks. The old idiom about killing the chicken to scare the monkey, and probably for some of them, Fang Fang was the chicken in that allegory, and that everyone else, scurried away. And I think there was also, of course, the arrest of some journalists that had been independent journalists that had been kind of crossing the line in terms of what was politically acceptable. I think cases like that did serve as an example to more liberal-minded intellectuals that they better Ming Zhe Bao Shen, to kind of keep their mouth shut, stay out of trouble, keep their head low. And in the case of Fang Fang, some people, one of the things the trolls claim is that, well, what's she whining about? She's just a baby. Nothing's happened to her. She's fine. Nothing's wrong with her. She was experiencing thousands of attacks on a daily basis, death threats. There were public calls to seek her out and kill her. There was a lot of sexually inspired violence that was just terrible, the way in which these kind of sexualized attacks, verbal attacks were being thrown around on the internet. I can say firsthand, I got a very small taste of that with, the couple thousand attacks I got. And I know it's just a fraction of what she experienced every day for more than 6 months. And so I'm sure that did serve as and you saw earlier, I showed the witch hunt account, the comment that who's next? Well, keep following Fang Fang, you'll find out. All of that serves as a kind of culture of terror that's going to make less bold and courageous individuals just scurry into their shells and keep their mouths shut and stay out of trouble. And I can tell you, having worked on the book and seen Fang Fang, I mean, one of the greatest takeaways for me is Fang Fang herself. Just what a inspirational hero, what a icon of courage. And I don't think anyone that could withstand this political whirlwind that she was in the center of for so long, and she stands her ground and she stands up for what she believes in, and she talks back to these trolls, and she I was incredibly not just inspired, but I really feel almost changed by her. And so my hope would be that other intellectuals, whether they be in China or outside of China, who read her work, hopefully they experience some of that courage, and that inspiring voice of Fang Fang rubs off on them, rather than being scared into their shells by the trolls that are out there. For me, Fang Fang has really been the kind of guiding light. And I mean, this is a crazy example. Yesterday, I subtitled a documentary film about impoverished children in China, just a heartbreaking work, and they paid me a translation fee. And after I watched that film, I just wrote to them and said, take the money and give it to those kids. And why did I do that? I've never done that for a translation gig, but I feel Fang Fang gave that to me, that courage and that sense of that what we're doing has a higher and deeper meaning, and to give back and to speak out. And so she really changed me in, I think, real deep ways, the experience of working with her, working on this book. And so this is a long answer to your question, but that's what I hope people take away, rather than being scared by the trolls. I hope she becomes a kind of model for what's possible, not just in China, but here as well.
Great, thanks. So we have a number of questions. So I asked that the questioners keep your questions succinct and brief. The next one is Keren from the College of the Holy Cross.
Hi, Michael. I'll make it quick. I think, well, Fang Fang is very justified in responding to many critics by identifying them as ultra-left, she also uses this language repeatedly and insistently, and she's also written, I think, blog posts. I think I read one of her 关于极左, where she also attacks her attackers by using what she calls 文革式语言, Cultural Revolution style language. My concern and question is that how do we, beyond our classrooms, where we can contextualize this, share her nuanced and close to the ground observations with an American or English-speaking audience without that language conflating either with, say, Chinese dissidents who have turned into pro-Trump factions, or with, Tucker Carlson, right, who use the same kind of descriptors. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, those kind of plays on language and playing with Cultural Revolution era linguistic details, I think they're certainly there. They are very hard to convey properly in translation if your reader isn't familiar with that historical context. And so, we can try to give that in, afterwards to the book or interviews and things, but that's always a challenge. But the latter part of your comment about the ultra-right in America, that's something that I think in some sense the ultra-left and the ultra-right look at each other as if they are arch enemies. I don't think they could find a better enemy, but in fact, they are mirror images of one another. And the types of engagement with disinformation, with fake news, the type of rhetoric, the trolling, the threats, it's exactly the same. And that became very evident to me. Again, in my afterword, I talk about this kind of the strange temporalities that I'm living in between past, present, and future, but also between America and China, because so many of the things that this book tapped into, which is, disinformation, troll culture, cyber attacks, US-China relations, the outbreak, and the politicization of the outbreak, all of that is happening here. And in many ways, it's quite uncanny, the similarities between the ultra-right here and the ultra-left in China. And so again, one of my hopes is that readers, when they engage with the book, they certainly don't want to weaponize it as something to hurt China, but also, that's the last thing any of us want, but actually it's the opposite. I want people to internalize these lessons, internalize this knowledge, and see that actually it's all happening here as well. And we're not special. We're not the privileged ones in America. America has the same faults, and actually it's all kind of a mirror of one another. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Fantastic, thanks. So now we have a question from someone from Duke, Albert Zhu. Albert, are you still on?
First of all, just thank you for letting us come, Mr. Berry. I appreciate it so much. And my question was this. And do you think there's a channel for people like Fang Fang in America to talk to government officials, whether about Corona or other problems? And can they be taken seriously or will they be taken as terrorists? Or do you think America's government is similar to China's in regards to controlling and covering what can be spoken and shown for the public eye?
Oh, a lot of loaded questions there. I think there's certainly some similarities. Unfortunately, I feel that the current White House administration has gotten a lot closer to the model of Xi Jinping and other more authoritarian regimes in the last couple of years than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And there is, I can't comment on Fang Fang, but there was a Chinese scientist who recently defected, someone who was working on the coronavirus from Hong Kong, who defected to the United States. And she immediately became a tool of Steve Bannon and Fox Media and the right-wing media, just scooped her up and made her into this kind of political tool. And so there is that risk that when Chinese speak out, and I've faced the same thing with this book and speaking out about this book, there is certainly a contingency of people who either, it's kind of black and white, you're for us or you're against us, and they want to politicize everything in very black and white terms. And so that runs the risk of you publish a book like Fang Fang Diary, and all of a sudden Falun Gong media outlets like Epoch Times want to embrace you as, oh, you're critical of China. So it's not what this book is about. This is not a China bashing book or it's a nuanced, complex account of one person's life during a very complex time. And so it's unfortunately been highly politicized. And what I've tried to do today is break down how and why some of that process took place. But what I always try to do at its core is strip all that away and get back to Fang Fang's core message, which I do feel are equally applicable in China, in the United States, and Europe, everywhere. And I don't know if I answered your question, but you can follow up if I missed part of it.
Great. So next up is Dave Seidor.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again for a great presentation. You alluded to it earlier about, are there any close representations of Fang Fang here in the US, like Dr. Fauci, Bob Woodward, or nobody? What are your...
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a really interesting question because on the surface, it seems like we have a lot of them. You know, you turn on CNN and you see Don Lemon and you see Anderson Cooper and you see Dr. Fauci and Bob Woodward, who you just mentioned, but none of them could serve the role that Fang Fang did in the sense that just like here in China, there's all kinds of media outlets, right? There's hundreds of cable TV stations and papers and websites and bloggers, but somehow Fang Fang cut through all of that noise and she became the sole voice of Wuhan for millions of people, at least during that first, say, 6 weeks or so. She was the voice. Li Wenliang, of course, became a kind of icon and a hero and a martyr, but people didn't directly hear from Li Wenliang, but they heard from Fang Fang every night. And she did become that very, very powerful voice. And I feel in the US, because of our inherent political system, we have a lot of voices that try to serve similar roles, right? The mayor of New York, Cuomo, you know, he was another one, but none of them can cut through the noise like Fang Fang did and unite so many people. And I don't know if that's because we're so divided politically, but I've been feeling these months, and I've been thinking about that question, and I do feel that the U.S. so desperately needs a Fang Fang, someone that can hold this government accountable and really speak truth to power. Because right now, that's one thing we're missing is truth.
Great, thanks. So next up is an author, Chinese-Canadian author, Zhang Ling.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Nice to see you.
Hey? My question is really very simple. I think you and Fang Fang are creating a history in a sense, because prior to Fang Fang's diary, I don't think there has ever been a Chinese book that's been published in a foreign edition first before the original. So I don't think as of today it is possible for a simplified Chinese version to be out there, but I don't know whether you are aware of whether there is a traditional Chinese version out there, either now or in the near future.
There's not. I don't know if there will be one. I don't know if I can disclose all this. I don't think there's anything top secret about it, but Fang Fang had signed contracts with a publisher, I believe in Hong Kong, that had distribution rights both in Hong Kong and Taiwan. However, that was halted. And so that not only that kind of jeopardizes also the Taiwan edition as well. That's my understanding of it. So hopefully at some point, the powers that be will ease up a little bit and realize that there's no poisonous snake hidden in this book and that it's okay for readers to see what she wrote. But right now, I don't think that's possible.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. So next up is Linshan Jiang from UC Santa Barbara.
Hi, Professor Barry. It's nice to talk to you here again and ask you the question, because I'm really interested in, at last you mentioned about the civil society in China, and wondering if it is possible for any Chinese platform of social media to have the potential to form the civil debate or civil society in China, or is it only possible in a more private or communal platform? Thank you.
Well, I would say Weibo has kind of fallen to the trolls in some sense. It's rampant with these kind of cyber attacks. And so at least in its current form, there's not a lot of civility in that platform. WeChat, I think it is possible because you choose your network of friends where your posts go out to. And so that way you create little bubbles of people with similar values and similar viewpoints. And so within those microcosms, I think you can have civil debate, but at least Weibo has kind of really, I think most Weibo users will attest to the fact that over the last couple of years, it's dramatically transformed and it's become a much more intolerant space. And ultra-nationalists have been much more vocal, much more violent in terms of their language and their use of words. And so Weibo just is not that site anymore.
Great, thanks. Next up is a recent MA grad from Duke, Chushu Liu. Chushu, are you still? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Barry. Yeah, thank you for your excellent translation, and your presentation reminds me that when Spivak raises the question, can the Spartan speak? And cyberspace today facilitates common people to speak out. However, as you have mentioned, there is a convergence of the cultural evolutionary vocabularies and also a fandom language, which is so popular and even incorporated by the official government of China. So how do we understand the voices of the real subaltern people may become further muted and marginalized by both the voices of the people who already hold the power and the people who newly get a trendy or fandom-like power in the cyber politics space? Thank you.
Yeah, it's very tricky. There's no clear answer to that. Right now, there's a lot of landmines I think you have to navigate in Chinese social media and in terms of speaking out, and for subaltern groups or marginalized groups. Like we said earlier, WeChat provides one platform, but of course that has limited impact. Another is just having independently curated websites whereby you don't have message boards, you don't have this kind of open space whereby the trolls can attack. I mean, for instance, there's several very valuable websites that have come up online with testimonies, diaries of various people who experienced the outbreak in Wuhan, and it provides a kind of clearinghouse for all of this information, including calls for help during the first 6 weeks of people who are desperate to get medical care for their families. There are there is a kind of preservation of those voices that's online, and so there are ways that people can get that out if they have access to an internet, if they have, you know, the ability to create these kind of platforms or contribute to them. But there are, as you know, censorship is a serious impediment to many people speaking out, and the trolls are a separate issue, and sometimes they dovetail with censorship, sometimes they operate in a kind of parallel or somewhat complementary form, but there are these challenges that people need to face, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I think it plays out in different ways in different places. Even in America, you see the Mulan controversy these last couple of days. You know, there's similar issues there as well. So,
great, thanks. So we have 2 more questions in the queue. Thanks for sticking around. So the next one is from a Duke undergraduate, Francis de Decidon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Francis, are you on?
Okay. So I would like to ask Professor Barry about like the bifurcation of the narrative. I think it sort of amazed and saddened me to see, you know, just how big the gulf got between the discourse in the West and in China. And it seems to be like a paradox because, you know, you translated the work, you know, between the 2 languages, and then completely different narratives came out. So I'm just wondering, how can we increase sort of the osmosis of the discourse between kind of the Chinese-speaking world and the English-speaking world better, so that there's more kind of a fair space for talking?
I mean, that's what we need. And unfortunately, both governments and societies are going in the opposite direction right now. I mean, there's a lot on this side in America, there's a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric, shutting down Confucius Institutes, criticizing, you know, all of the racist language by which the virus is referred to by the current administration. I think Trump didn't even say if Biden gets elected, we'll all be learning Chinese. I mean, as if it's a bad thing. It's like, great, let's all learn Chinese. But we're going in the opposite direction, and in China as well. Everyone's finger pointing. And so I think a lot of it falls on the shoulders of individuals, people like us, scholars, students, intellectuals, to build interpersonal connections and exchanges. And that's almost all we got, because I feel the governmental exchange is collapsing before our eyes. It's just really falling apart. But one of the key, I mean, this whole trade war and all of the conflicts, I feel the behind the scenes, probably an even more egregious imbalance isn't the trade imbalance, but the cultural imbalance. And this is something I say to my students all the time is, you go to China and you walk around any college campus and grab a couple kids at random and ask them who's Lincoln, who's Washington, who's Mark Twain. They could tell you who all those people are. You walk around UCLA, Duke, I'm assuming, you walk around and grab random students and ask them who's Lu Xun, who is Zhou Enlai. They're not going to know. And there's this just basic cultural disparity in terms of basic knowledge of what Americans bring to the table in their engagement with China. And I think we all need to work very hard to try to even the playing field to some degree. But in terms of something like this coronavirus narrative, it's very difficult because in China, it's a top-down narrative. So just to give you an example, I mentioned all those alternative narratives that are cropping up in China to take the place of the whole left by Fang Fang's diary's absence. This is the description of one of those books. I'm just going to read. This one is called Diary of the Battle Against the Virus. This book reveals an accurate account of the Chinese people's resolve to conquer the novel coronavirus under the strong leadership of the party Central Committee with Comrade Xi Jinping as its core. The Wuhan frontline reporters went straight to the scene, where they dug deep and provided a complete account of what happened. Each report contained in this book is so real, vivid, heartwarming, and moving. The book conveys to the reader firm ideals and beliefs, like no matter what hardships we face, we shall rise up and overcome. We must face our challenges head on and push forward, work hard, and do our best to control the outbreak and ensure that economic and social development can continue as planned so as to make a positive contribution to the building of a thoroughly prosperous society. This book is our way of paying our respects to the frontline medical workers, PLA soldiers, and other comrades who stood at the front lines in the battle against the coronavirus. This book is also suitable as a study guide for party members nationwide, cadres, students from elementary through college, and the broad masses. And so how do you bridge the gap between that and, Wuhan Diary? And part of what that's trying to do, that's trying to bridge the gap in the sense it's trying to correct what's politically, ideologically wrong. This is the correct story. This is the good story. If you remember at the beginning, I opened with David Wong's quote about who gets to tell the good story. This is the good story that the CCP wants to tell. And every detail there almost seems like it's directly written for Fang Fang. They're talking about frontline workers, right? Fang Fang's at her house. They're the front line. They're witnessing everything, talking about accurate, and they're claiming that she's dealing with hearsay and peddling lies. They talk about, this being a study guide, whereas her book is basically a poison weed that should be ripped about, and so you instead have this and that's why I talked about that bifurcation, because it's diametrically opposed. And so I don't know if there's any way to bridge those, but I will say, for those if you're a student of modern China, of history, culture, literature, or you're teaching it, I think it's an imperative for all of us to read both and to understand the CCP's line and understand the non-official line. Somewhere in the middle, we find a semblance of truth. But unlike that narrative, which talks about a complete truth, I, for one, don't believe in a complete truth. All we have are fragmented truths, right, that we piece together and try to come to some semblance of the complexity of what happened. And I'm sure a lot of these accounts are very moving, and a lot of them are true, and a lot of them are inspiring and incredible. But at the same time, they're framed through a very particular political lens, and what's left out, we will never know. And that's why it's so essential to have voices like Fang Fang's and other voices that provide an alternative view on how we look at these things.
Fantastic, thanks, Michael. And the final question of the evening will be from Orphelia Fangfei Wang, who is one of our MA students.
Hi, Professor Barry. Thanks for the inspiring talk and discussion. My question is regarding nationalist sentiments associated with Fang Fang's diary. So news about the translation really exacerbated public's negative opinions on the diary, since making Fang Fang's diary available to the rest of the world would further expose our family internal ugliness and scandals. So her diary seemed to be a sword in Chinese people's eye. Of course, there are multi-layered nuances and historical reasons about Chinese national pride, but Fang Fang's diary seemed to prove the current internet climate that being critical of your country equals being a traitor. So I would like to know about your opinion on Chinese people's obsessions with keeping their skeletons in their closet and maintaining a perfect image in front of their global competitors. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, that taps into one of the dynamics that was playing out here, and this notion that China was airing it's showing it internally was okay, but as soon as it's shown to the world, that's not okay. And that, like I said earlier, is really a demarcation line whereby it becomes politicized to a whole new level and gets pulled into this US-China trade war or Cold War. My take on it is, I don't want to generalize, and I want to say that it's not just China, but I think all of us need to, there's no such, let me find the words. I don't think that, it's not a question of who has the right. I mean, there were all these essays online. Does Fang Fang have the right to actually publish this diary, or the right to publish it abroad? And there were all kinds of heated debates about this. For me, that's a non-question. We all have the right to bear testament to the things we experience and see and believe, and we have the right to publish them wherever we live, right? Or wherever we want to publish them if there's a willing publisher. I mean, this is just but the fact, but there is certainly an obsession that latched onto that and politicized it to an unprecedented degree. But for me, and I think for Fang Fang, it's just a non-issue. It's of course why shouldn't she publish this diary? And it's all about the context and the way that, I mean, all of the detractors who claimed this is going to be weaponized to hurt China, or this is, going to, all of the various allegations, they're the only ones that made them. And so that's, I think, I find a really fascinating aspect of this, is that all of the paranoia about what this diary could be, they're the ones who manifested, not us. It's not, with Congress, Trump wasn't waving this book on TV and saying, now I got the evidence to hurt China. It was the ultra leftists in China who were doing that. And so they created the weapon they're talking about is of their own making. And a really good metaphor for that is a lot of those 1-star reviews on Amazon that try to kill the book. Some of those would then get back translated into Chinese and posted on Weibo as quote unquote evidence of the book's failure and inability to connect with American readers, and also taking all the talking points like it's all lies and fabrication and saying, look, even the Americans say it's all lies and fabrication, even though those are posted by PRC ultra-nationalist reviewers. And so anyway, I'll stop here, but hopefully that somewhat addressed your question. Thank you.
Great, fantastic, thanks, Michael. So this is a very timely project. But our time is actually up. We're actually half an hour over. So I'd like to conclude by once again thanking Professor Dwyer, President Dwyer, for initiating this event, for thanking the APSI staff for coordinating it very expertly, the Critical Asian Studies Program for co-sponsoring it, thanking all of you out in the ether that on a Friday night, at least here on the East Coast. We thank you all for logging on. And most of all, thank you, Michael, for sharing your time with us and for a very, I think, interesting, enlightening discussion. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure.
Yes, thank you. In some ways, Michael, you are playing the Fang Fang role right now in the US.
I do feel, I hope I've internalized some of those lessons. I really do. I feel like this experience has changed me more than any other book I've translated or book I've written. It's really been an unusual and an exceptional kind of experience. So I feel there's a certain responsibility that I have after Fang Fang entrusted me with this, and I have to run with that. I have to embrace that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and good evening and good morning or good afternoon or